President. Let's say the Pledge of Allegiance together.
To the flag of the United States of America, and to the republic for which it stands, one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Please be seated. And continuing with our fun theme from last year, today is International Greet Everyone You See with Good Day, Mate. Continuing with that theme, our jokes of the day. We have two today, they're short. How many Aussies does it take to change a light bulb?
Oh, I know. 3 Polacks.
Oh, now that was
Sorry.
That's you got the number right. It's 3. It's 1 to hold the light bulb and 2 to trim the ladder.
Oh, okay.
And then what do you call an Australian in the finals of the World Cup?
Now I'm in trouble.
A referee. Today for our Rotary Minute, I'd like to read to you Farron Barr's post. Farron Barr is president or past president of the Topeka South Rotary Club and an exemplary Rotarian, and he's on an international service trip to South America right now with some folks from our club and many others. You are making this possible. You are supporting him, and as a member of Downtown Rotary, you helped to make this happen. So day 2 in Guatemala, the entire team hiked from the clinic in Pantananic to the village of St. Louis to meet with the students and teachers there. The Topeka South and Downtown Topeka Rotary Clubs donated school supplies and toothbrushes to the elementary school. We even got to play basketball with the students and teachers. We lost. The remainder of the day was spent painting the clinic in Pantananic and building 2 exam rooms. This was a rewarding and labor-intensive day. Day 3, he posted about Guatemala. We started the day by going to the Pantananic Elementary School, where we gave vitamins to the students and we gave school supplies to the principal, Cesar Garcia. The playground balls were donated by the Downtown Topeka Rotary Club. The other supplies were a combined donation from Topeka South and Downtown Topeka Rotary Clubs. We were able to see a performance by one of the grades afterward. We then finished the painting of the clinic in Pantananic, and we also finished building the exam rooms. We concluded by assembling the 20 water filters donated by the Downtown Club. 10 were delivered there, and the other 10 will go to San Juan on day 4. When we returned, we met with the president of the E-Club of Atitlan Lake and had another banner exchange. Another long, exhausting day that had great progress and many rewards. That's our Rotary Minute. If you served in 2017 and 2018 on the Rotary Board, would you please stand up? We have a lot of Rotarians who have given a lot of time and a lot of service to our club and to our community. It was a pleasure serving with every one of you, and we want to recognize and thank you for your service above self. Terry Hobbs is a great example of model Rotarian. She did double duty managing both Red Badge presentations and career days. Please give our outgoing board and the board of 2017-2018 a big round of applause. Our June featured charity is celebrate 30 years of women in Rotary for hygiene kits to support women in need in disaster areas and underserved countries. David Beck, you're invited to the podium, and while you're on your way up, our toast today is to the Rotary Club of Aalborg Vestry in Denmark. They have 95 members. They are in District 1440, and President Peter Korsbeck is their Rotary President. So if you would join me in toasting the Rotary Club of Aalborg Vestry. Here, here.
Sorry for the confusion here. We're often confused. Is anybody wondering why we chose that club? They are the host club for our exchange student that we are sending to Denmark very shortly, Zion Williams. Zion will be leaving for a year in Denmark, August 11th, and she has gone through a rigorous process, which includes learning a few words of Danish. Still working on that, though. Zion, would you like to say anything?
I'm just really thankful for all your guys' support with me going to Denmark, and it's really heartwarming to have like such wonderful people that care so much about everybody.
We are going to send Zion with some Rotary, with our club banners that she can exchange. There are actually 5 there's a lot of Rotary clubs in Denmark, and I'm not sure how many she's going to be able to visit with. We'll be sending her off with that, as well as a check. As you may remember, she was the featured charity last month that enough money went for it, so we'll have a check to present to her before she leaves as well. So join me in wishing Zion well in her year in Denmark.
Zion will be eager to hear of your travels and your adventures. We have several proposed member announcements. A business membership for Jeff Pavone and Stephanie Gasson. They are General Manager and Director of Sales, respectively, for the Cyrus Hotel. They're sponsored by Gordon Lansford. They're here today. And then we have a community service member, Bradley Hopper, with Hopper Design Works. And he's sponsored by me. We have a couple of new Red Badge members to present to you. I don't think they're here today. And a couple of last minute notes. We also have Mary McBride. If you would stand up, she's a guest of Katie Brown today. And we have a tradition here. We say, this is Mary McBride. Hi, Mary. And she is Inspire, Incentives, and Meetings. So welcome, Mary. And we also have Jeff and Stephanie here as Gordon's guests as well. So if you would stand up, we'll say hi to you as well.
Hi, Jeff.
Hi, Jeff and Stephanie. Thank you all. Let's give them a hearty. The last quick announcement. Linda asked me to remind you to please check off the attendance list in back. So even if you don't grab their name tag, please remember to check off that list for attendance. That'll help her out as well. And with that, we'll invite Kirk Johnson to the podium to introduce our speaker.
Thank you, President Mark. I am proud to introduce today's speaker, Roger Aeschlimann. Roger serves as Vice President and Trust Officer at Core First Bank and Trust, providing comprehensive and caring personal and financial assistance to customers of all ages. He is a certified trust and financial advisor, managing more than $200 million of customer assets and assisting with lifestyle matters and estate management. Prior to joining Core First, Roger was the Deputy Secretary of the Kansas Department of Human Resources under Governor Bill Graves, and he was responsible for customer-focused programs including unemployment insurance and workers' compensation. Before that, he served as the Chief of Staff to the Speaker of the Kansas House of Representatives. His early career was as an award-winning newspaper reporter for the Topeka Capital Journal. He holds a bachelor's degree from Kansas State University and a master's degree from KU. He and his wife Robin are community leaders working through Boy Scouts and Girl Scouts, Rotary, Junior League, First Baptist Church, and other educational and military organizations. Roger is a past president of this club and holds multiple Paul Harris Fellows. He was the president of the Shawnee Heights Board of Education and has served on a number of community boards. Roger is also a published author, and his Iraq memoir is titled "Victory Denied, Everything You Know About Iraq Is Wrong." He has also been published in military, educational, and governmental professional journals and makes frequent public presentations on the military, history, and financial matters. Roger and Ryan have 2 adult children, Ryan and Reagan. And for the past 32 years, Roger has served our country in the Kansas Army National Guard and the Army Reserves. He served 3 command tours and volunteered for 2 combat deployments. He was awarded a Bronze Star for his tour of duty in Iraq and the Defense Meritorious Service Medal for a tour in Kosovo. I think it's a real nice coincidence that Roger is our sort of fill-in speaker for today, because you see this last weekend, Roger officially retired as a colonel in the United States Army Reserve. So I think it gives us a good opportunity to both welcome him to the speaker's podium and say thank you for his service to our country.
At the Battle of Waterloo in 1815, Napoleon Bonaparte made every effort to keep the enemy coalition from uniting against him. Napoleon hoped to first fight and destroy General Blucher's Prussian Corps, and then turn against the Duke of Wellington to pick off the English Corps, and then one by one pick off the other corps from other Allied countries. Napoleon had made his entire career of this tactic of dividing and conquering. He hoped to succeed, and he nearly did at Waterloo. But the Duke of Wellington won instead and became a national hero at Waterloo. At the end of the battle, Wellington spoke to a reporter of the day and said, "It's been a damn serious business. Blucher and I lost 30,000 men. It's been a damn nice thing. The nearest run thing you ever saw in your life. By God, I don't think it would have happened had I not been there." And Wellington used the word nice in the sense of uncertain. The quote has been corrupted over the years into a cliche, a damned near run thing. Had Blucher and Wellington failed to unite, had each of them failed to exercise dramatic personal heroism and leadership on the battlefield, both of them right in the thick of the fight the entire time, both of them with horses shot dead underneath them, both of them with bullet holes in their clothing, had they not done that, the battle would have gone to Napoleon and the French. The French would have consolidated control over Europe, perhaps even avoiding the terrible world wars of the 20th century and maintaining and expanding its empire in Africa and South Asia. Unquestionably, France would still be a great world power today. More recently, the famous spy, Maxwell Smart. Hey, Mark, would you move this flag? You're very kind, thank you. Maxwell Smart, aged 86, at control, was notorious for his catchphrase, "Miss me by that much." Had Max not been quite so lucky quite so often, it's clear that chaos, that international organization of evil, would have overtaken the world and we would all be speaking Romanian today. History is full of these damned near-run things. This morning we'll explore some of these little-known near-death experiences and how the world would be different had it not missed them by that much. Let's start at the very, very beginning. The Pica was a 2-inch long worm-like critter swimming in the deep seas of the Cambrian world about 530 million years ago. It was food for everything else in the ocean and totally unremarkable, except the Pica was the first creature with a notochord, a rudimentary spinal column. Thus, the first ancestor of us all. The Pica was pretty much defenseless and dependent on the dark and cold depths of the ocean to survive at all, but it lived through 4 massive extinction events in the 500s and 400 BCs, 4 million BCs. And while the record of these fossil events is very, very fragmentary, 95% of all living creatures died in these extinctions, but little Pica was the survivor. So, to the horror of creationist believers of all religions, here we are today. Had the oceans been just a little more anoxic or warmer or colder, the pika would have died out too, and it's possible that highly evolved, sentient, but spineless squids or honeybees would be the dominant species on the planet today. In 1754, a very young British officer named George Washington was fighting the French and Indians on the western wilds. Fort Necessity was poorly sited and terribly constructed and soon fell to the French. Washington negotiated a truce allowing the British and the militia to march away, but dozens were killed by Indians during the march. Washington was shot at. Washington was further blamed for that and almost drummed out of the service in shame. But in 1775, General Braddock led troops back into the region, including the still young George Washington. Another trouncing followed, and another retreat turned into a rout as the Indians slaughtered the fleeing British and militia. Washington personally created a rear guard holding the Indians at bay at tremendous risk and under personal, constant assault. 25 years later, fighting against the British, General Washington and his army were trapped on Manhattan Island. Tiny Fort Defiance cannoneers defended against the entire British fleet, opening a very small window of opportunity for Washington to direct the escape of the army to the mainland. Washington was under constant German British fire, had bullet holes in his clothing. No one here needs me to hypothesize about the failure of the newly born United States of America without the brilliant generalship and then the seminal 8-year presidency of George Washington. When the Revolutionary War broke out, the Continental Congress dispatched somebody. Let's give it a try, if you will. Thank you very much. We're frozen up. Why don't you play with that? The slides aren't essential. They're kind of cool. You're just something to look at besides me. So hopefully they don't ruin your dessert appetite. When the Revolutionary War broke out, Continental Congress dispatched John Adams to France to rally the support of the American cause. Sailing across the Atlantic in 1778, the trip through the winter storms was treacherous. Lightning killed 19 sailors. The ship was attacked by several British frigates. At one very near moment, a cannonball passed directly between the future president and his son, John Quincy Adams, another future president. The ball brushed both of their sleeves. Adams Sr. was instrumental in the founding of our nation, and later nearly single-handedly prevented a war between the youthful USA and France. His son, John Quincy Adams, more than any other American, was responsible for the vision of a continent-spanning USA. Did it, Stan? You did it. You're the man. Great. Thank you. Damn near-run thing. Missed me by that. John Quincy Adams was responsible for his vision of creating a continent-spanning USA. Over his long life, John Quincy's efforts created or set into motion American ownership of the Gulf Coast, the Midwest, the Louisiana Purchase, Texas, the Southwest, Alaska, and Hawaii. Without John Adams Sr., France might have overrun the USA in 1812. Without John Quincy Adams, America today could very well be limited to the East Coast, with Spanish to the southeast, French to the northwest, and English and Russians on the west coast. Matthew Maury Fontaine in the late 1820s gained appointment to Annapolis through the influence of Sam Houston. Fontaine Maury became a midshipman aboard a frigate. The frigate was carried the Marquis de Lafayette home after his famous tour of the United States. Maury was on the amazing voyage of the USS Vincennes, the first U.S. warship to travel around the world. He was a young man on the move and slated for great things at sea, then disaster. In a stagecoach crash, Maury suffered a catastrophic broken leg. He nearly died. His recovery was slow and painful, leaving him a cripple and ineligible for sea duty. Maury remained in the service and was eventually assigned as the superintendent of the U.S. Naval Observatory. While there, he discovered thousands of old ship logs and charts in storage trunks dating back 200 years. Maury pored over these documents, gaining information about winds and calms and currents for all seas and all seasons. This led to his publication of the Wind and Current Chart of the North Atlantic, which showed sailors how to use the ocean's currents and winds to their advantage and drastically reduced the length of ocean voyages. Maury's uniform system of recording oceanographic data was adopted by navies and merchant marines around the world and was used to develop charts for all major trade routes. Maury made many important new contributions to charting winds and ocean currents, including ocean lanes for passing ships at sea. His sea-based work eventually led to similar studies on land, and modern meteorology owes its existence to him. Because the able seamen became unable, sailors and pilots and astronauts today are enabled by his work on barometric pressure, temperature gradients, thermoclines, haloclines, currents, winds, trade routes, and ocean lanes. Maury went on to create the first magnetic sea mine, and he founded Virginia Tech. The man nearly killed by a broken leg is buried in Richmond between Presidents James Monroe and John Tyler. The USS Princeton disaster in 1844 destroyed a presidency and was causal to the U.S. Civil War. In a ceremonial cruise down the Potomac River, the newly built steam warship USS Princeton had 400 guests on board, including President John Tyler and his entire cabinet. Also aboard was the world's largest naval gun, the Peacemaker. The gun was ceremoniously fired a few times to the great delight of the onlookers, who then filed below deck to drink. Several hours later, the captain was convinced to fire one final shot. The enormous gun exploded, killing Secretary of State Abel Upshur, Secretary of the Navy Thomas Gilmer, and 4 others. Spared were Tyler and former First Lady Dolly Madison. And also Julia Gardner, a very rich young New Yorker who became Tyler's wife and bore him 7 children. While John Tyler was not the most important president of all time, he did annex Texas, which irrevocably set into motion the U.S. Civil War. The Princeton disaster also was a PR disaster and turned the entire country against Tyler, who had been seen as a moderating influence in the increasingly rancorous slavery debate. Tyler's re-election would have allowed the development of a House divided, with a slavery South and a free North, and everyone just assuming that's the way things are in a republic of states. Alternatively, had Tyler died in the Princeton disaster, the nation would have faced a tremendous constitutional crisis. Tyler, who as vice president, aggressively and perhaps unconstitutionally assumed the presidency upon the death of William Henry Harrison. Harrison had no vice president. Tyler, once he assumed his vice presidency, Tyler had no vice president. Had Tyler died, who gets the job? Probable a dogfight between Daniel Webster, Henry Clay, and John Calhoun, although friends would have led to an even earlier dissolution of the United States, and perhaps a successful one without a war. Additionally, Secretary of State was historically the path to the presidency. Upshur, as president, may have been able to hold the Union together or facilitated a gentle divorce. Little Tommy was running to catch a train in 1857. If he did not get on board, he would not work selling newspapers, and if he didn't sell newspapers, he didn't eat. The train pulled away and sped up. And little Tommy slipped and was falling under the steel wheels when a porter reached down, grabbed him by both ears, and heaved him on board. Tommy heard a cracking in his head, and for the rest of his life was 90 to 95% deaf. Tommy actually considered this a blessing, as it gave him the quietude to focus and work even when surrounded by inventors and machinery. When he died, he had nearly 1,100 patents, including direct current generation and distribution, the electric light bulb, phonograph, and movies. Certainly no one person would have replaced the Wizard of Menlo Park, Thomas Alva Edison, nearly run down by a train at age 12. In 1864, a slave child was born, and before the week was out, he was stolen by outlaws pillaging in the South. His 10 siblings all died, his mother disappeared forever, and his father was never known. The infant, cold and wet, was finally traded back to the original owner for peanuts near death. He survived a raging fever, but it was a very near thing. Years later, he was admitted to college in Iowa based on a written application. The school was horrified to have a Negro show up and start classes. But he stayed, worked as a janitor, slept in a broom closet, and he learned. And when he died in 1943, The whole world owed George Washington Carver for 400 uses of the peanut, hundreds of uses of pecans, soybeans, and sweet potatoes, the creation of 500 different dyes to replace European dyes no longer available due to World War I, and especially the innovation of crop rotation, which forever changed the balance of power in the South by killing keen cotton and replacing it with balanced farming practices. Carver's science here drove poor whites and black sharecroppers off the farms and into the cities where they changed the face of America forever. While it is inevitable, maybe hit it again? While it is inevitable, someone else would have eventually discovered peanut butter. The black diaspora from the rural South to the urban North cities was not an inevitable thing. Because the slave infant survived, there is clear linkage that his science led to the urban conditions of the 30s and 40s that led to the civil rights movement. All right, we're rocking it. Okay, one more. Yeah, good. Keep going. Okay. Okay. And stop. Thank you. Oh, okay. Carver. We good with Carver? Oh. Okay. In 1916, an unknown Austrian artist went over the top of the Western Front. Of the 240 German soldiers in that company, 239 died under the machine guns and artillery of the French. The sole survivor crawled back to the German lines with scratches, ringing ears, and one sleeve shot off. I don't need to say anything more about the near-death experience of Adolf Hitler. Fanny Kaplan was a 16-year-old Russian communist Jew violently opposed to the Tsar. She was arrested after a bomb plot and was sent to Siberia, stripped nude and nearly caned to death, losing most of her eyesight in the process. Freed after the murder of the Tsar and his family, Kaplan eventually turned against Vladimir Lenin as he was neither communist nor revolutionary enough for her taste. In 1918, at the age of 28, the nearly blind Kaplan shot Lenin. He nearly died. Kaplan claimed to be solely responsible. She was promptly executed, but Lenin and company doubted she acted alone and retaliated widely and violently, instigating the Russian Civil War and killing at least 100,000 Russians a year for the next 50 years. Had Kaplan been more accurate in her shooting and killed Lenin, it's possible the then leaderless communists would not have launched the Red Terror. The whites might have won the Russian Civil War, the Soviet Union never been created, and Russia today would be a valuable and friendly member of the international community. But probably not. All right. Everybody knows the French armies crumbled in the face of the Nazi attack through Belgium at the start of World War II. Everyone knows the Allies were outclassed and hapless, and the Nazi blitzkrieg was unstoppable. Everyone is wrong. The Nazis were stopped cold at the Moose River at the city of Sedan. Every bridge was blown. The Germans were under air and artillery attack. Every German trying to cross the river was killed. The Germans were on an extremely tight operational timeline. If they did not get to certain locations at certain road junctions and certain crossing points at certain times, the Allied forces would be able to mass against them and recover from the surprise attack. This happened at Sedan. The Germans were stopped. If the Allies could just hold for 24 more hours, reinforcements would arrive and the Nazis would be thrown back. The Germans would lose World War II in 1940. But Nazi Sergeant Walter Rubarth was not to be denied. He crossed the Moose River alone in a rubber raft and destroyed a French bunker. Then another, and then another. Then he went back across the river through the small gap he had created. He brought 11 other Germans with him. Over the next 2 hours, they blew up 11 bunkers, killed hundreds of French soldiers, and in a moment of PR genius, Rubarth raised a Nazi flag high over the city, and the Germans started shouting out in French, "The Germans are everywhere, the tanks are coming, run, run!" The French fled in terror, the Germans broke through at Sedan. 5 days later, the rout was over, the British were trapped at Dunkirk, and the Germans owned Europe. Walter Rubarth, 28 years old, won the war for Germany. Rubarth later was killed in Russia after Hitler stupidly declared war on the Soviet Union. Had Hitler left Russia alone and focused on defeating the British, it's likely the entire continent would be German-speaking today. The Cold War would have been between the Germans and the Soviets. Walter Rubarth would be remembered as the greatest soldier of all time. At the exact same time Sergeant Rubarth was single-handedly overrunning Sedan, the French Countess Helene de Poitiers was hectoring her lover, the Prime Minister of France. She wanted him to surrender and unite with Germany against England. She hated the British and especially despised Winston Churchill. As the Germans overran France, the French and British Prime Ministers met at Dunkirk to plan the final defense of the continent. An actual merger of British and French forces into one unified command was proposed, and at that instant, the Countess leaped at Churchill with a butcher knife at his throat before the Churchill's bodyguard was able to subdue her. Needless to say, this threw a wet blanket on the planning, and the fate of France was sealed. The Countess was decapitated a week later in a car crash, but had her reach been just a bit longer, or the bodyguard just a tad slower, Sir Winston Churchill, Lion of England, the driving force of victory in Europe, would have been dead in 1940. Without Churchill's dynamic leadership, Great Britain would undoubtedly have sought a quick peace agreement with Germany. Hitler was equally ready for peace with the British, so he could turn against the Soviets. Japanese would not have bombed Pearl Harbor knowing they were starting war with the United States without allies. Had the Countess killed Churchill, it's possible World War II would not have been fought at all, and few would remember the German border squabble with France 75 years ago. The World War II destroyer, the William D. Porter, was just flat out unlucky. You should write the name down, go look it up on Wikipedia, read about it. There are many interesting incidents to be cited, but here's the key. During a practice exercise in November 1943, the destroyer actually fired a live torpedo with the battleship Iowa. On board the Iowa were Franklin Roosevelt, President, Secretary of State Cordell Hull, the entire Joint Chiefs of Staff, including George Marshall, all on the way to meet Stalin and Churchill in Tehran for a conference of the war. Had the torpedoes sunk the Iowa, the last 70 years of world history might have turned out quite different. Stalin and Churchill, without Roosevelt, might never have agreed on a joint plan to win the war, and could very easily have turned on each other with separate peace with the Germans. The great Allied invasion of Normandy never occurring, with the Germans and Russians defeating Great Britain. The U.S., busy with its war against Japan, might have found itself alone in the world surrounded by enemies. Fortunately, the Iowa dodged the speeding torpedo, and history unrolled as we know it. Remember the Chelyabinsk meteor in Russia 3 years ago? 5 years ago. Big as a house with 20 times the power of the first A-bombs. It exploded 20 miles in the sky and still caused 1,000 injuries. Well, in 1989, a different asteroid, this one as big as a mountain, missed Earth by a whisker in galactic terms. Had it hit, we would have evaporated the oceans and blasted away the atmosphere, an instant extinction event with no survivors, a dead planet. That near thing is celebrated every March 23rd by a near miss day. And finally, in 1962, an 18-month-old child crawled out of the house in the middle of the night, crossed a highway, crept into a grocery store, and was inadvertently locked in overnight. He was located in the morning and returned to his parents. At age 17, scaffolding collapsed, and he desperately clung by his fingertips to the top rim of a 60-foot farm silo before he was pulled to safety. At 18, he was in a sand hopper when a grate fell on his head, knocking him unconscious to the bottom of the pit. A truck full of sand backed up to the pit and began to dump. The truck driver looked down just in time to see a body disappear under the sand, and the boy was dug out. At 19, the young man narrowly avoided a head-on collision with the semi by driving into a ditch. In his 30s, a tank gun barrel uncoupled and its 5 tons instantly dropped where his head had been a half a second before. In his 40s, he was nearly thrown from a helicopter, making an evasive maneuver, nearly shot down by ground fire during a night flight to Baghdad, nearly decapitated when an idling helicopter was swept aloft by a gust of wind and spun out of control towards him, and while this person may never amount to a damn thing, had these damn near things not missed me by that much, you would not have heard this presentation today. Q&A on these little topicettes, or other people can have interesting comments about damn near things.
I would add that those descriptions of multiple head injuries explains a lot.
Yes, thank you. Yes, sir.
Remember, Wellington's army was British, not English. There were Scots there as well.
You probably didn't follow instructions very well. And I was expecting Phil to pipe in that a single torpedo was never going to take down a U.S. battleship, but well, it's dramatic. Yes, sir.
If you ever update this to keep going because history keeps happening.
Yes.
Because I just learned this a couple of years ago, but the Cuban Missile Crisis and the, the Russian who just happened to be on one of the subs, the Russian subs that made the decision, even though it was ordered not to fire, that could have been a completely different end and everything.
It will be very different after a nuclear holocaust. Thanks, everyone.
Wow, Roger, thank you for that enlightening presentation, and thank you for your service to our club, our community, and our country. With that, instead of giving you a gift that you don't need, we have speaker books that you will sign the nameplate of. It's Horizon is the name of the book today, and those go to Ross Elementary School's library. Next week we'll be in the Capitol Plaza at the Emerald Ballroom, and Christy Pankritz from Safe Streets will be our speaker next week as well. And with that, let's rise and say the 4 1/2-way test and convene.
Is it the truth? Is it fair to all concerned? Will it build goodwill and better friendships? Will it be beneficial to all concerned?